Hello everyone. The climate crisis is the greatest existential threat that humanity faces, and yet we're collectively unable to deal with it adequately due to a whole host of systemic forces which incentivize exploitation and destruction of the planet. What do we do? Well, today Annika Mock and Kristian-Marc James of SG Climate Rally join Sean Francis Hahn and I to talk about the global, the Singaporean, and perhaps most importantly, the human context of the climate crisis. And we talk about how structural change can occur and what SG Climate Rally is doing, how they seek to create change and how they're going to sustain themselves, sustain their movement, and how Singaporeans can make a difference. As always, if you find this helpful, do support the production of more of these podcasts by becoming a member of New Narrative at newnarrative.com/join, or you can donate at newnarrative.com/donate. And now, Subash.
Asia, stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go? This is utopia. Please stay where you are. We've come way too far.
Welcome to Political Agenda with me, TJ Thum. I am sitting here with three guests in front of a map of Southeast Asia. I'm wearing a green and pink batik shirt, and my pronouns are he, him. And joining me today, as always, my co-host, editor-in-chief of WakeUp Singapore, Sean Francis Hahn. How are you doing, Sean?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm glad to be back again. I'm wearing a white shirt, and my pronouns are he, him. So I'm very excited to get into this because we're talking about climate change. It's an issue that's dear to my heart. And of course, we're going to be talking to one of the biggest and most visible climate change activist groups in Singapore, and that's SG Climate Rally. So I'm joined by two representatives today, and those are Annika and Kristian. So would you like to go ahead and describe yourselves? Yeah.
Sure. Hi, I'm Annika. I am a fourth-year environmental studies major from Yale US College. I'm wearing a white shirt, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, my name is Kristian. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am wearing a blue floral shirt. I just graduated last year, but now I'm just working at a tech company and obviously working with SG Climate Rally on the side.
All right. So let's just jump right into it. What is SG Climate Rally? How did it get started? When was it formed? What does it do? You know, what goes on in the day-to-day operations of SG Climate Rally?
Day-to-day operations.
Annika, can we hear from you?
Yes.
So what is it? Yeah.
So SG Climate Rally is a youth-driven movement. We started June, mid last year, and we formed with the sort of goal to do something around Global Climate Action Week, which was in September. And so we had a couple of months to figure out what would be the sort of collective action event that comes out of Singapore, because a lot of international sort of movements were working up to that date. And I think the question was, are we ready for a climate strike in Singapore? And I think the sort of answer among us was ostensibly yes. And so we decided to do it on 21st September. And it was an event at Hong Lim Park. And we had 2,000 people come and gather, listen to speeches about the sort of urgent need for climate action in Singapore. We had a die-in where everybody collapsed on cue, just to sort of represent the actual existential threat that climate change presents to all of us. And yeah, from there we've been growing the movement, trying to engage as many people within civil society, within Singaporean society, various stakeholders, in mobilizing as many people as we can to push for climate policies that are commensurate with IPCC recommendations for a livable future for everybody.
All right. So, I mean, we're living in the COVID times. These are strange times to be in. And of course, we couldn't have another SG Climate Rally this year. So, Kristian, can you tell us what has been going on? What are the projects that SG Climate Rally has been working on this year?
Yeah, I think for us within the movement, we talked a lot about whether or not we even wanted to have another rally, just because it kind of seemed a bit weird if this became like an annual thing, and it's just kind of like a festival that people come to, every year just for one day, and then you kind of like disappear. That didn't really kind of I guess, match the, kind of like the urgency that we were all feeling. And so if we were going to do another rally, it was going to be kind of like very different. And, I think that was always something that, we weren't super tied to having another rally. But I think, just kind of building off what Annika was saying about SG Climate Rally also, I guess we focus a lot on kind of trying to educate people on the need for structural change and systemic action. A lot of the discourse and narrative, not just in Singapore, but, all over the world, is always about kind of like the importance of individual action. And, obviously that is important, but also we're at a stage where we need kind of like radical structural institutional change. And so then all the initiatives that we were doing, I think, stem from kind of like this need to try and raise awareness about that, and also to try and make it a more political issue. And so kind of right after the rally, kind of going into 2020, the first thing we kind of did was this thing called Greenwatch, which was this initiative to look at the different parties' political manifestos, their climate-related policies, and assess them. Look at try and build some sort of climate scorecard. And something else also that actually Climate Rally is quite focused on is trying to educate people on intersectionality. Right, the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect groups that are already marginalized, and so reflected in this climate scorecard then were also not just kind of like looking at technical policies and kind of like measuring their efficacy, but also looking kind of like how these policies will ensure that if we do and when we do transition to a more green way of living, do they in fact protect the people who need to be protected. And also looking at things like how does the space in Singapore encourage civic engagement and things like this. And so these were the things that were measured in the climate scorecard. After Greenwatch, we then came together to form a coalition with other activists, other organizers in Singapore, and we helped co-organize Activism in Crisis. And because I think an intention for us was also to start trying to build, obviously, partnerships, allyships, and just build, I guess, a larger civil society movement within Singapore, and try to get green groups to realize how political the climate crisis is, and also other civil society groups to realize that you need to start thinking about the climate crisis. And then that brings us to kind of now where we are working with some other organizations like Made for More, Welcome in My Backyard. We're looking at kind of how can we support migrant workers in this time, looking at what the lockdown does, for, I guess, their mental health. And I think so that's coming out soon, and also how we've had discussions with them about how it is so different from kind of being in nature as opposed to now kind of just being trapped, what that does to the mental health. And so, trying to connect these things again. And I think so that's kind of like what we're doing, because I think that's all kind of, I guess, the main spirit of SG Climate Rally is trying to focus on climate justice. So all our work kind of centers around that.
So you brought up some very interesting issues like mental health, migrant labor, right? Now, I want to just ask, regarding like structural issues, radical structural change, right, which you mentioned just now, what would that look like? What does that look like to see that come to fruition?
That's a big question. And I believe it was asked also to the climate education guest that you had. And so I think on a similar vein, there's just so many sort of things that need to co-evolve at the same time. And I think the first being just a recognition of the crisis in our leaders. And, obviously we see how that can be a piecemeal gesture from like South Korea declaring a climate crisis and then shortly kind of endorsing a coal power plant in Vietnam, right? And, beyond just declarative statements, we need to see an actual roadmap to decarbonization and to a just transition. And those things need to start with a sort of commitment from the top and a sort of permanent cease to the need to individualize climate responsibility, which is, a sort of phenomenon that we see a lot in Parliament now. And I think there needs to be a radical shift from the myths that we have been peddling around individual responsibility, around the need to rely on sunset industries like the petrochemical industry. And yeah, I think alongside these shifts, there needs to be a cultural shift where people, slow down themselves and are given the opportunities to embrace, working less. And we had a great chapter at the end of Eating Chili Crab where, Bertrand laid out a post-carbon future, right? And that involved degrowth. And, one of Climate Rally's principles moving forward is going to be, denouncing unfettered economic growth and, having that not be a radical statement, because it's so plain to see that these current trajectories that we're on are harmful. And I don't want to, have future children of mine, if I'm having any, kind of raised and chastised for looking at a system and looking at business as usual and saying that, that's not right. And I think that we also need to create an environment for, as Tomiko was saying, loving critics to come to the fore and be celebrated. And, this involves there being a spirit of collaboration on the level of governance where, individual voices are prized and, youths that are bringing up concerns are valued and not seen as pariahs. And yeah, so those are, I think, a lot of the changes that are needed, and certainly not an exhaustive list. But yeah.
So you brought up unfettered economic growth, right? And that's endemic, just intrinsic, or just at the very heart of capitalism itself, right? So do you ever get this sense that, in a way, we are putting the cart before the horse here, that the economics comes first? Because I think a lot of people find it very difficult to imagine a life outside of capitalism, a little bit harder than to imagine collective climate action. So I'm going to shoot the hard question at Kristian here. But do you feel like there's a sense in which the economic bit is so important and so hard for us to conceptualize that it makes it a little bit difficult to push the climate agenda further?
So I don't necessarily think that it's hard to imagine. I think there is a lot of literature out there on what it means to move away from unfettered growth, and to kind of recalibrate how we measure success. And there's just a lot of literature out there on moving away from things like the Human Development Index, because that only looks at very specific things, including national income, which obviously then is premised upon this idea of continuous growth and things like that. So there are a lot of alternative models out there for sure, and obviously I think I don't think it's unintentional or unrelated that these things also don't necessarily come to the fore, right? We're not necessarily talking about some of these alternative ways of living, alternative ways of measuring success, right? It is, I think, quite intentional that some of these things are not necessarily being entertained, and not being integrated into kind of common discourse, So I do think that there are indeed, alternatives out there that we can, that we should be trying to push for. And I guess that's kind of where SG Climate Rally comes in that, frankly, obviously it's not necessarily our job to come up with, kind of economic models and things like that. But what we're saying is that there are indeed things out there, and we want to try and kind of raise collective awareness of kind of this need to move away, or to just kind of rethink kind of our priorities, right? If we can get kind of everyone around us to think, hey, okay, do we actually really need to be increasing GDP for a country like Singapore? If we can get people to think about that more, then I think that will also signal to politicians and other institutions that look, okay, this is important, right? Now we, I guess, have to do our jobs and actually think of the policy. And maybe some of these people who are raising these things have ideas that we can collaborate with. So I guess that's kind of where SG Climate Rally fits, and kind of, I guess, what we think about the future we want to see and how we can get there.
So another big part of structural issues, right, is of course the structure of social consciousness, right? And you and your team are definitely aiming at changing that, right? So what are some of the roadblocks that you come into when you're trying to change the minds of people, right? I mean, for me, when I talk to people about climate change, I often find that there can be some difficulty. Sometimes people don't see the relevance. Sometimes people are kind of nihilistic. They're just like, we're just not gonna have kids, and then just screw it. We'll just phase ourselves out of existence, or something along those lines, right? Or they tell me things like, capitalism's never going away. We've just locked ourselves in this bad place, and then let's forget it. Let's just try and get out of this earth with a good scorecard. What are some of the common roadblocks that you face when you're tackling, trying to change minds?
And if I can add on to that, right, I think part of the reason why those roadblocks are there, especially those mental ones, is the sheer scale of the challenge in front of us. That listening to you, we're trying to solve the climate crisis, which is the biggest existential crisis that humanity might have ever faced. But to do that, we need to then solve the crisis in capitalism, which is so pervasive, even though it's very recent historically, right? Since the 80s only, we've had neoliberal capitalism. So it's a very recent phenomenon, but one that's become so utterly pervasive to how we live our lives. But to solve that, we need to, in many ways, solve the crisis in democracy, and the inability of people to have their voices and opinions represented in the political process. And this is global, and this is why we see the rise of extremism around the world as people get frustrated. But of course, in Singapore in particular, we have a very authoritarian government that doesn't welcome a lot of alternative perspectives, to put it mildly. And to solve that, we also then need to change society and how people see themselves, their role as citizens, their role in the political process, right? And get people to participate actively when we've been conditioned over 2-3 generations to sit back, put our feet up, and let our politicians do our thinking for us. And and there's of course a lot of fear about what happens if you do speak up. And so you've got this incredibly multi-layered challenge in front of you. To solve this, you need to do this. To solve this, you need to solve this. To solve this, you need to solve this. So you're kind of a microcosm of the massive challenges that face Singapore in every major issue in some ways, but you're dealing with the most important issue. So
so that scale is very, very daunting. I think there's a sense in which we recognize the smallness of ourselves when examining or even confronting the climate crisis, right? So how do you deal with that? I think it's a natural human response. How do you try and overcome that very natural human smallness, that feeling of insignificance? Yeah.
Hey, we don't ask the easy questions.
We had like cookies and milk and everything, and then now we came with the hard questions. It was a bit, No, but I mean, it's. I'm asking sort of because I kind of want to live my politics and I want to talk about it with my friends, right? And I'm not gonna lie, I face that sense as well. Like it's easier for me to kind of, think about, all right, maybe I'll just donate money, or like I'll go and help cats, or I'll go and join an NGO that does work that's direct, right? There's a person there and I can help that person, I can see that help. But the climate crisis, I can't even conceptualize what that would be. I do something and I don't see any results and I'm just a bit demoralized. And then some redneck in America is like, it doesn't exist, and then it's just, and then you just get so demotivated. So I think even for myself, I want to know, how do I kind of conceptualize this problem that exists on such a massive scale?
Okay, I will try. Okay, so I think that alongside many of the multi-layered, I suppose, phenomena at play that PJ very helpfully summarized, there's also another layer of, I think, privilege in being able to contend with these things in the first place. And unfortunately, the matter, the fact of the matter is that, in order to even access these really deep existential questions, you need to free up mental space. You need to have, an environment that privileges these conversations in contending with big questions that have no answers and have no simple answers, rather. And I think something that we're trying to do in Climate Rally is really just kind of democratize access to that space, in the sense of, this is an awful thing, an awful situation, but here is a kind of environment where we will break things down for you. And so in Activism in Crisis, as you might have heard from Minxie and Kumar, we really emphasized accessibility, right? And so it's things like breaking down what does positive feedback loops mean, what does environmental degradation, forest fires, what do all those things really mean, and making these events free, making it that all of the infographics that we put out are in simple language, and actively trying to break down the mechanics of a just transition, and hopefully in doing so we are able to offer this resource to people who don't know where to start, and don't know what to do with themselves, and then alongside that comes the sort of emotional trauma really that I think springs from meditating on these questions, and that really is an ongoing thing, right? And I think the only self that I have to that is just building community that is uplifting and that is regenerative. And so in Climate Rally, trying to have a mailing list and have a sort of Telegram update chat, and have our neighborhood Greenwatch groups that came out, Activism in Crisis, all of that is in the spirit of building communities that fear together, that panic together, that dream and hope together. And I think to your question about having these conversations with people who are not immediately allies themselves, I think a lot of it is just coming from the point of view of, well, of course you don't know about this because there are so many systems that prohibit honest communication around these things, right? And I think it's starting at wherever their sort of interests lie. And so if they say that they care about people living in like one room rental flats, and it's like, okay, these places aren't air conditioned, what happens when temperatures increase 3-4 degrees to these people, and it's like, oh yeah, if we care about that, let's think about the kind of systems and phenomena that are in place that support or drive us towards this eventuality, and the kind of real human cost that exists from there. And I think people have a huge propensity to care, and I think very often we forget that in the climate space. Like, we think that we're just a very small number of people, but I think climate issues are so cross-cutting that really, if you care even a modicum about your neighbor, about your family, your parent, you can care about the climate.
I think also, but that's also to say that I think we have, recognize that a lot of times maybe we may be, preaching to the choir or speaking in echo chambers. I think a lot of people always bring that up. And I think that's definitely a recognition also on our part that, like, as the movement has evolved, how can we start talking to the people who maybe actively don't care about the climate, not just the people who are, your middle ground who know about it, but also just the people who are actively against it. And something that I think maybe I'm kind of overstepping and going into, I know you want to talk about strategy, but very quickly, kind of like, I guess, our theory of change a little bit, and how that's evolved, at least in kind of how do we move towards, I think, organizing work. Something for me, I know this distinction between kind of like mobilizing and organizing, and how mobilizing is just kind of getting the people who are already invested to kind of come into your space or come into the thing that you're trying to create, as opposed to organizing, which means building a bigger, broader movement. And so something that's very important to achieve climate rally is, like we said, intersectionality, but also just kind of like workers' rights, I suppose, and how do we start organizing and like going down and actually talking to people. And that's I guess, for example, the thing that we're doing with the migrant workers is kind of like a step towards that. And so then hopefully with these conversations also, we can get people, I guess, on our side, or at least more aware of some of these things. We've had conversations about how can we actually go down to and talk to workers on Jurong Island. What are their fears, what are they thinking about, look at things like workplace safety, because that's a big thing, and that's and that is a product of the industry, right, of how hazardous that thing is. How can we support these individuals? What do they want, right? Because I think at the end of the day, that's kind of the SG Climate Rally, at least, is about how do we protect our workers, how do we protect everyone, how do we make sure that if we transition, we do it in an equitable way. And so, just I think having more conversations with people who are on the ground, I think, is something that's become incredibly important to us, and something that we hope to do more of.
And if I can ask though, what you're describing is what stands out to me is you're working among the most powerless people in Singapore, right? So there's us. We're activists. You're in university or recently graduated. We have very little power to influence Singapore in the sort of conventional way. And then you're working with people on the ground, and especially with migrant workers who are probably the definition of the most oppressed people by the capitalist system, by the political system. They don't even get the right to stay or the right to vote. So why work with so you're working with sort of the victims of capitalism, but are you also trying to work with the people who wield capital, right? Because they're the ones, the most powerful force in Singapore is actually foreign capital. Given the way our economy is set up, our political system is set up, foreign capital has an oversized influence on our policies and on our government, and arguably more than voters themselves, right? Because our elections aren't free and fair, and because the political system suppresses our ability to speak out. So are you actually trying to work with capital, or at least pressure capital, to change? Do you have any strategies to affect the people who actually can make a difference?
So I think that one thing that we've been understanding from the last year of our existence is just that those doors aren't open. And any kind of effort to have a discussion with capital is fruitless, really. And so I think from our point of view, it's a matter of trying to gain critical mass from the ground up. And that really is a sort of ongoing process, and certainly movements take years to do that, and we've only been around for one. And so I would say that we don't have any faith that there could be even an honest dialogue with systems of capital and the sort of institutions that uplift and keep it going, right? I just don't find that to be possible.
Okay. So I want to jump off that point, right? So you had Desmond Lee and Louis Ng come on and get affiliated with SG Climate Rally, right? So what is that kind of like, working with power? And how does that factor into what you just said, which is, systems of capital being uneasy allies? Yeah.
So I think an interesting thing that exists in Singapore is this, like I said, the doors are closed to corporations per se, but to your elected representatives, the doors are slightly ajar. And so I would say we were reached out to by these ministers, and it was alarming to us really that a small fry group of people would be, I suppose, even under the radar of these ministers. But I think, interestingly, they were open to dialogue, and we had a audience with these ministers alongside Amy Call before the rally and after the rally as well. And Desmond and Louis also attended our rally and were photographed at our rally. And I think the strategy that we employed, if we can even call it a strategy, was that we didn't want to close that door just yet, because it was important to us that we get a certain kind of two-way discussion going about our demands, and our demands at the time and still are adherence to IPCC recommendations, and so peaking emissions by 2030 and completely zero net emissions by 2050. And that's not a goal that's been met, but these demands of ours require that we have a discussion and justify ourselves to these people. And so we were keeping those doors open, and it is a difficult process because in the wake of Climate Rally, there was a lot of talk in Parliament and for the first time, climate action and emissions, a pathway to kind of scaling down emissions was brought to the table in Parliament. I know Anthea Ong asked a question about whether or not there would be a consideration of our demands at all. And I thought that was very significant. And it was met, obviously, with the sort of usual PR statements by Teo Chee Heng. But I think we have to play this difficult game of wanting to keep that door still open whilst also, needing to hold people to account and, wanting to call out when, bad behavior exists or when, just plain, I suppose, falsehoods exist in Parliament. And yeah, it is difficult. And another thing that has sprung up, and you talked about, how do we deal with our smallness, right? And I think one thing that we were trying to bring across is that, a youth climate movement coming out from the ground with, such traction with 2,000 people and with, a very, very, I would say, successful event should not be something to celebrate. That is a failure on the part of our elected representatives. And, when it's met with this romantic language about, oh, it's so wonderful to see young people rise up and take charge of environmental action, that to me is expressing ignorance at the fact that there are some core failures that have existed in our political system and in the approach of our elected representatives. And to me, that kind of I guess, recognition of our anguish and our fears are diminished at the second that you romanticize what we're trying to do. I don't want to be pat on the back. I want action.
Is there a sense in which also that, I understand the bit about keeping the door open, but is there a sense in which movements get co-opted? There's that risk there. There's that sense in which a lot of these dialogues become a prop. They become a kind of gimmick or a PR tool in order to, kind of posture that, hey, we're new, we're in touch with the young ones. Please vote us back in so we can continue authoritarian rule. Thank you very much. Yeah, is there a sense in which you feel that might be happening, is happening, or there's a risk of that happening?
For sure. I mean, I think something that we try and be very intentional about is kind of remaining autonomous. And I think this also kind of goes in line with how, I mean, apart from, I guess, kind of like these gigs once in a while, we try not to put like, specific faces for the movement, right? The idea is that we are decentralized and it's not necessarily something you can kind of just like put your hands on. Because we recognize the power of co-optation, history of co-optation also, and trying our best to still negotiate, I suppose, this space of autonomy that we currently kind of have. But how then do we kind of leverage, I suppose, leverage these opportunities that we get? And I think we're quite privileged that I think we obviously have kind of different organizations within the climate movement who, employ different strategies and who can also do this work of maybe, spending the labor to talk to ministers or talk to parliamentarians or just kind of like other people within the state, who do the closed door dialogues or whatever. And, those things are important, and, it helps also with obviously kind of figuring out the inner workings and inner mechanisms, and so I think at times we are intentional with whether or not, for example, kind of like our movement sometimes needs to show up, or whether or not another group can do it. How do we kind of negotiate that, right? Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of the movements that we are affiliated to also, we're all on the same page, and we think about how do we deploy kind of like the best person to go for this particular thing. Also on top of that, I guess with SG Climate Rally and kind of what we're trying to do with expanding the movement, that also means kind of expanding kind of different strategies or employing different strategies. And so something that came out of our general elections campaign, Greenwatch, was that we kind of have this kind of virtual space right now called Neighborhood Greenwatch. And so the idea is that you have passionate and interested constituents who do want to engage engage their parliamentarians, right? And so then they can and they are willing to, have those dialogues, have those very specific kind of engagement, and they can do it, right? But it's still for the cause. It's still kind of, hoping that we slowly shift the needle. It's just that, someone else now does it, and we've kind of empowered and enabled them to do that because we've kind of created the space.
Can I pick up on a word you used, leverage? And I think that actually is really important, because preventing, or at least keeping yourselves from being co-opted, right? You need leverage. If you look historically in Singapore, a lot of very successful activism movements have been co-opted by the government because the PAP government has funded them, right? And given them money to make them sustainable. And in exchange, they then accept the premise on which the PAP conducts politics, which is you don't independently organize and mobilize, but you take part in our slow, considered policy-making process, a very elite process, closed-door sessions, right, where the elites decide what is going to happen and what the policies are, rather than, political contestation, political mobilization, the things you were talking about earlier. So I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you what you'll do if you end up in a position where the government says, okay, we'll give you lots of money and we'll recognize you, but you have to stop organizing and mobilizing, politically. But instead, I want to ask about, have you actually thought about how to increase your leverage as an organization? First, via the increasing influence, especially influence over voters via organization and mobilization, but also your sustainability as an organization and your ability to then act independently of government funding, right? I think we just had a discussion in Parliament. We're recording this on the 10th of October, where who was lamenting the how arts funding, the whole artistic industry is heavily reliant on government.
As in Parliament, is it?
Yeah, someone in Parliament is saying, I forget now. But that's how independent spaces are co-opted through funding, right? So that's my broad question is about your leverage, and on the one hand, which you've talked about a bit already, influence over voters via organization and mobilization, and on the other hand, your sustainability as an organization and your ability to act independently of the government.
Great questions. So I think I can speak to increasing leverage. The best thing one of the greatest strengths of Climate Rally is that we really don't need any money to operate. We don't have any paid staff. We just have a website, and that requires, I don't know how much a month, but
$100.
Yeah, but it's really nothing that will set us back at all. And what I find to be the most important aspect of Climate Rally is that it's not beholden to anybody, and I think for as long as we exist, we will probably stay that way. And we don't rely on sponsors, we don't rely on consistent donors, and I really appreciate that. And it will probably stay that way. We are youth driven. We each have full-time jobs or full-time preoccupations. And I think that autonomy is one of the reasons why we are so strong. And to your point about sustainability, within Climate Rally, we are actively structuring ourselves as a decentralized group, which means to say that we have a certain set of core principles and values, and as soon as you kind of come on board and subscribe to these values, you are empowered to start a working group and begin a campaign under our Climate Rally name. And so the Project Open Doors kind of sprung from one of those sort of free working groups, right? And as long as you have an idea and it's passed by the group, you are free to use our resources. Our publicity team is sort of available to you. You can use our name. You can, do whatever as long as it corresponds to our principles. And that's the way that we grow, and that's the way that we sustain a sort of visible presence and push the movement, really. And I think that has been quite successful because there is no one authority that is, having to check every single working group. There isn't this sense of I suppose, burnout setting us back, because if one person is burnt out, another 10 people will come on board and start a new project. And I think a sort of metaphor that we always use is the idea of a choir. And, if within a choir one person stops singing, the melody and the sound is still consistent, because, you have so many other people who are backing you up and sustaining that. So I find that to be one of the strengths that keeps us running sustainably.
I want to sort of ask here as well, like, one of the things about decentralization here is, obviously reflected by the fact that there are two guests, right? And that comes from that philosophy of not wanting to have a centralized image or person that represents the whole movement, right? And while I really like that idea, right, there are also, I think, huge benefits of having a sort of figurehead, right? Somebody who represents the ideas, who kind of takes credibility or credence for the entire movement, somebody who you can speak to, you can go to immediately, just a general leader, just a general face of a movement, right? So those are, I think, big advantages, and you're choosing to deliberately to eschew them for this sort of decentralized lack of a figurehead kind of approach. So what is the thought process behind that? What's the philosophy behind that?
Chris?
Yeah, I think some of it also had to do with just kind of like, it's not circumstance, but like I think that, historically when the group came together, it was like a few people who were like, oh, okay, I guess we're all, part of this. But also, I think it's also reflective kind of the issue also, in that, we don't necessarily want this to be just to become kind of like, like a niche subject, or, like to relegate and kind of how current systems work, to make kind of like the environmental movement kind of like, very specific, or also just like, then you have very specific images of the people who care about the climate. And I guess our idea is hopefully, with kind of decentralizing, we're also hoping to kind of reflect what we want. We want people to think, or how we want people to approach the climate crisis. We want to like normalize it, right? And also normalize that the climate crisis is indeed a political issue. And so then being able to kind of reflect that in the movement helps also then with people kind of coming on board whenever they want to, and kind of doing whatever they want. Because I think something that's quite important to us also is that, I think something that we've alluded to, right, and I think PJ you alluded to, is how multifaceted the climate crisis is, or just kind of like the system that we're in, right? And so that is definitely going to require different strategies, different kind of mini theories of change, different people who have different ideas. And so then it is to our advantage to try and spread out as much as possible, and to wield kind of whatever we have, because this thing is it's so big in scale.
Yeah, I think also just a quick caveat is that like we're not indiscriminate in terms of like who can start what, right? I think that it's important that we still have certain guiding principles, right? And so one of them being, we are a movement to stop humanity's harmful impact on the climate and drive emissions to net zero by 2050. And that's a target that hopefully all campaigns keep in their mind. Another one is that, we prioritize the rights and flourishing of humans, and that, we believe that flourishing should not come at the cost of the planet or environmental degradation. And so I think these things give people a good framework upon which they can use their creativity and their resources however they wish. And I think another thing that I wanted to talk about was also the sort of like risk that is associated with being in climate rally. And I think part of the beauty of having, a sort of unidentifiable head, or rather no head at all, is that risk isn't disproportionately absorbed by one person. And unfortunately, that's really the kind of mindset and consideration that you have to have when you're, taking on these giants. And just me and Chris being here also, I guess is at the back of our minds as a certain idea of like, who among the government is watching, and like what kind of public enemy status do we have now. And like I said earlier, these are all just things that I would hate to exist for the next generation, but unfortunately right now these are things we have to navigate. So
I have to say, that makes a lot of sense to me if you look at the success of, say, the Hong Kong movement. Well, success in relative terms. But also, of course, me personally, New Narrative, I feel that I am a point of strength and weakness, being visibly the leader of New Narrative. And it does worry me that if the government wants to take me out, it would severely handicap New Narrative. So trying to build an organization that can survive you is very, very difficult, right? It's like, if the PSP loses Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, I guess the SDP has two leaders now. So they have, but they're still very visibly these two people. But what you're doing is creating a movement where the idea is stronger than any individual, and there's no one point of weakness, and I really respect that. I think it's very hard to do, but I think it is a very valid and in long term very effective strategy. So
that means a lot.
Kudos.
Thank you.
Actually, no. On that, something that we had a meeting with another organizer from another country, because we just we're always this is an ecosystem, right? So we were talking to someone else, and someone was saying that if with decentralization and kind of building the movement, I think the idea is that if one day the whole movement got wiped out and there's kind of only one person left, can they restart it, right? Do they have the know-how and the resources and the knowledge to really and kind of know the belief systems of the movement to restart it and get it going again? And I think that really stuck to me and really struck me, because then I think that's also, I guess, kind of what we want to do also is what does it mean for this movement to live beyond just me and Annika and other people.
I want to ask about the benefit and the cost as well about putting yourself out there as a young activist, right? I mean, the cost is massive, I'm sure, right? As you mentioned earlier, there is a looming fear of who's watching, whose blacklist are you on, can I get a job in the future, what are people going to think about me? But at the same time, it is, I have to say, from personal, it's really rewarding, right? There is, you gain so much knowledge as well. So, I mean, I kind of want to know, how do you kind of negotiate that? Maybe with your parents or your friends, with your employers, how do you kind of negotiate that? Maybe Chris, since you're working, I kind of want to, because I'm about to get a job at some point, and then I think a lot of young activists out there are kind of thinking about, this is doable for now, but then what happens when I need to get a job? Yeah.
No, I think that's I mean, for sure. I mean, I think that I can't deny that obviously plays on my mind, constantly, for sure. How much I should self-censor or what I should and shouldn't say. Definitely, it's still there. But I think there are kind of maybe certain privileges that are accorded to me because, for example, I'm not like a public scholar, or I'm not I don't work for the public service and things like that, and obviously that means some certain level of freedom, and I think at least within the movement, something that we think about is obviously kind of safety and who can come out in public when needed, right? And who can kind of sit back and maybe do some of the back end stuff. And that's kind of how we also then divvy up the work, I suppose, in that I recognize that I'm right now not necessarily beholden to kind of any sort of body. I'm not bonded or whatever, right? And so then that is something that I acknowledge, and so then I step up, and then other people who recognize that that's not necessarily something they can do, they then try and do work in a different form, because it's still as valuable.
Okay.
I think for me, the reality is doing this work is the only way I know how to live with myself. I think at this point, which is sad, I guess, when you think about it. But it's also immensely rewarding and such a huge privilege to have found a space that reflects my political inclinations, or my personal values and drives. And it's been one of the biggest, I guess, privileges of my life, really. And planning Climate Rally, I did not think how life affirming it would be. But it was really the most important thing I feel I've done. And so how do you negotiate something that doesn't pay you anything but gives you a reason to live? versus like needing to work and feed yourself and your loved ones. And these are the questions that I think will become more real for me in a year. But up until that point, like, it's like things like what Chris said. It's realizing that I have probably one of the most amounts of economic, social privilege within the movement. And so like what can I do but take on this risk and take on this difficulty. And like I guess the sort of questions of employment will follow. But yeah.
I want to ask now, your movement is very heavily decentralized, right? Does that ever pose any issues when it comes to coordinating projects, right? Because I don't, it just came to my head kind of like, how does that work when it comes to managing and organizing? Because I was thinking about my work with WakeUp Singapore, and everybody there's kind of a specialist. Like I have a stats nerd, he does stats. I have a meme guy, it's like that's all they do. All he does is memes, literally. Like all he does is look at memes and make memes, and he's great at it. So how does it work when you're coordinating all of these diverse, very talented individuals, that are springing up, that are decentralized? How do you coordinate that?
If I can layer on that also, like it's a question of resources and allocation of scarce resources, right? Which then that's the definition of politics. How do we allocate the scarce resources we have? And in an organization with a hierarchy, the person at the top ultimately gets to make the final call, or you have some sort of structured decision-making process. Whereas what you've been describing sounds very, decentralized, to use that word again. So how do you decide how to allocate your very scarce resources? And in particular, like, I guess here, your number one resource is the time and energy of the people involved. Do you leave that up to the individual, or is there any sort of decision-making process about the allocation?
Yeah, these are big questions. I think within Climate Rally, there is a active restructuring process happening that I'm a part of, where we're looking at exactly what you're saying. Like we don't want to be squandering the human energy and hours that go into running projects, right? And I think something that we're thinking about is within Climate Rally really having a sort of routinely elected core circle of people that sort of is re-elected every 6 months or so, to really overview these new working group ideas and pitches, and either say you have to rework this idea, or you can go ahead and these are the kind of people that you can get in touch with from publicity or from education to support whatever campaign that you have. And I think that the way that we've been doing it right now hasn't quite implemented that idea of a core circle because it's still in the works. But I think what we've done is basically, if there are sort of big questions that involve, let's say, putting out a statement in solidarity with a particular group, it would go through a sort of announcements chat where people vote on a poll. And once we have a certain sort of majority, we will just go ahead with it. And so that's been the case for the last year to varying success. I think you're very right to point out that it's a difficult model because people get tired so easily. You want to make sure that you're really maximizing each campaign, and that you're cutting it or rather you're calling it off if it's not working. And so something that we are trying to do in this new restructuring system is when you start in a working group, you have a certain set of sort of guidelines, a certain set of goals. And, if you feel like at any point you're not able to meet it, then you are free to dissolve. And, it's setting up these guidelines to empower within the group deciding how you want to use your time and resources. And if it sort of requires effort and thought outside of the group, then bringing it to the group in a bigger discussion for like some sort of consensus-based decision making to take place there as well. So a lot of these things are happening in real time, this restructuring.
We also have, I think, some like we have like a group of people called like the People Support Group who help with kind of not necessarily so much the allocation of resources, but like undeniably there maybe are people who end up maybe taking on a bit too much work, kind of picking up slack or whatever, right? And so then these are the people who probably may get burned out quicker and things like that. So that's why we have, I guess, a people support group who are there to help with just general morale, but also just like trying to check in with these people, looking at how they're doing and seeing whether or not some of this work that they're taking on can then be redistributed again. You always kind of need to recalibrate, and so the people support group is there to kind of proactively look at how some of these things can be distributed, because as much as you would try and democratize it, for various reasons, somehow, certain people may end up taking the work. And so it's then the people support group, their job to come in and try and, as much as possible, mitigate that.
So sticking on this idea of organization for a little bit more, how do you deal with disagreement in a decentralized group, right? On my side, it's easy. We're all just experts in our own area. If this is a theory problem, that's me, right? If it's a stats problem, that's the other guy, right? So there's not really, we're it's a small team, and we all just have our own niche. But for SG Climate Rally, it seems like, how would you negotiate that? There's not going to be some head figure who comes in and then slams the gavel and he says, okay, it's going to be decided in favor of X or Y, right? How do you sort those out?
No, it's tough. I think.
Does it come up? Do disagreements?
No, we
I'm
all
sure
agree
they.
with each other.
Right?
Climate crisis.
Is it like
ended,
a?
Yeah.
I mean, but is there a sense is there kind of maybe a homogeneity maybe in the sense okay, we're roughly on the same page. I'll close one eye. There's a general sense in which, because I think that there are some groups where the cause is bigger than myself. Whatever I disagree with, I'll shut up and I'll agree with the majority. But are there times where disagreements do come up, and then people really put their foot down, and it's difficult to decide either way?
I think at least that's definitely been, I think, an ongoing conversation with SG Climate Rally, and kind of, I suppose, our bigger goals, or particularly I think our theory of change, right? What does it mean to I guess try and move towards this idea of climate justice, which we've try and shift it towards, as opposed to maybe going down kind of the possibly more technocratic route of just going green economy,
policy think tank.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. And so that's definitely been something that we have had many conversations about. What does it mean to support and publicly support and endorse other civil society movements in Singapore? What does it mean to actually value and acknowledge the need for allyship? That's not necessarily something that a lot of people see as a priority, or at least didn't immediately see as a priority. And so having to have those conversations about then, I guess, going back to the guiding principles and, kind of refining our guiding principles such that, these things are things that you have to buy into to be a part of the movement. But also at the same time, then we have, going back to the voting system, it's not just yes, no, or abstain, but, there's always I actively endorse it, I have reservations, but I will go ahead with it or whatever, right? And you've got these different scales, so that then you also kind of know where people are, and then members of the group or people support can come in and check in on those other people who may not necessarily agree, and try and work with them. Something that we, I think.
I think it's also trying to almost operationalize homogeneity, in a way. Obviously as a group we value diversity, but there needs to be a certain set of shared ideals, and like Chris was saying, we stand with movements for equity and justice. We are non-violent in word and deed, and so if, let's say, someone wants to come up and talk about having a climate strike or having some sort of a riot of some sorts, that would just fall patently against what we stand for, and so we would not be able to endorse that, and that's clear. But I think where we have certain gray areas would be, I don't know, whether or not we want to, say anything about PMD bans, right? Does that fall within our purview? To what degree is that aligned with a just transition? And so these are the opportunities for conversations, like what Chris was saying. But it is very difficult, and
So I want to get just a general sense of your individual theories of change, right? Keeping in line with the decentralized theme here, right? I'm sure there are going to be different ideas here, but maybe we could start with Annika. What is your theory of change? How do you think it does happen, it should happen, it will happen. What do you think goes into making the revolution happen?
I think for me personally, it aligns quite closely with climate rally in that I think that we need a sort of critical mass to push policymakers to set more ambitious policies. But recently of late, I've been thinking a lot about burnout and just like existential dread. And, I think that's much more endemic among young people these days. And yeah, I think a lot about, the kind of fears that people have just on a day-to-day basis, right, of being alive right now, in COVID times, looking at how, ice sheets are melting and introducing new diseases, right? Like, how do you contend with all these things as such a small person? And I think for me, alongside this sort of collective action, there also needs to be mass regeneration where people, are given the space to feel upset about these things and to feel betrayed by these phenomena and the people who have enabled it, right? And within that, what do you do once you feel anguish and anger? Like I would love to be, a part of a future that then takes that emotion and turns it into, expanding activist possibilities, expanding future possibilities. And however that manifests, I'm really not sure at this point. But I think for me, I've been looking a lot at art and the work that creative communication can do to uplift people, like in the wake of the elections when, there wasn't an opposition wipeout, when, we had a climate activist, Raisa, elected in parliament for the first time. That was something to celebrate. And, we really came together and felt so much for it. And I think that, using these wins as opportunities for regeneration are also very good. But when you don't have wins, like, what do you do with yourself, right? And so part of what I hope to do is create a community to sustain people for a world where we get more losses than wins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How about you, Kristian?
Yeah, I mean, it's like Annika. I don't think it's wildly different from SG Climate Rally, but I think something, at least from kind of like my own personal lived experiences, also coming from with very specific kind of like socioeconomic backgrounds and things like that, thinking a lot about what does it mean to be of a certain class, and how I guess the climate crisis also is an issue of class, an issue of kind of like labor rights, and how kind of expanding sort of the rights of workers, the rights of individuals also can help with then with people voicing out their own concerns, and if these concerns are fairly and justly acknowledged, then we can obviously move towards, I think, a world that's a bit more co-created and a bit more collaborative, which will also then necessarily, I think, combat the climate crisis and get to a place where not just kind of like we are looking at more regenerative ways of living and being, but then everyone around us, is more valued, not just for like the work they do, but also for the identities that they hold. So I think that's very important to me.
Okay, another thing that I wanted to add was also, actively supporting existing structures that point towards a regenerative future. So I think if you haven't already spotlit where's mutual aid, I think mutual aid is a fantastic thing that has come out of this year. Just having it in a spreadsheet and having it championed by so many people, these are things to celebrate and to really give visibility to. And I think for me, it's just so incredible that people are being encouraged to sort of give unreservedly and learn how to ask as well, and trust in the community. And so I think it's my theory of change will also involve having a society that also actively supports these mutual aid ventures that don't rely on the state for provisions and support. Yeah,
actually I think that was what I was gonna say, in terms of kind of like trying to get people to recognize the importance of being in a community or being a citizen of this particular space, right? And what does it mean to engage actively in civic engagement, or just I guess fighting or advocating for the community you live in, and making sure that everyone in that space feels the same way, and is empowered. I know, like anecdotally, I think after the elections, I saw on like Twitter that there was someone who put like a QR code on their lifts, their elevators. I don't know if you saw that, about like kind of like planes that were traveling over their HDB, and so they were like, hey, yeah, you scan this QR code if you're affected by like the noise levels. I want to try and write into our MP about this, and I want to get data. And I was like, that's like super cool, because it's just like a regular citizen who has now realized that there are people within their space that also may feel a certain way, and feels compelled to bring in their voices, but also then take that onto themselves to then go to their MP to engage with them. And I think just more modes, or more just being able to see that as something very important to do, I think is something that I hope we do also with SG Climate Rally, and hope to kind of increase that consciousness.
So I just have one last question here, which is that one thing that always stuck with me was a conversation that I had with like a coffee shop uncle, and then he just very flippantly told me over coffee, he was like, y'all young people, y'all leftists, Marxists, whatever, right? You're all like this because you're young, right? You try to get to 30, 40, you got 2 kids, you got HDB and all that kind of thing, you see if you're still a leftist, right? And that kind of stuck with me, because I did kind of notice that was how it tended to progress, that fire gets kind of extinguished along the way. How do you negotiate that? How do you deal with that? Like, is there a plan or sort of an idea about how to keep it going? And how do we keep it going for the next generation after that? Yeah.
Maybe I should answer
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I was like, wait, is this for us?
Yeah.
Because I'm 40, I have a kid, I have a mortgage to pay on this place, right? And the fact is, I don't want my son to grow up in a world. I want him to have a world to grow up in, right? Full stop. And this is the point I made last week, that if you look at how young people in their 20s wrote and thought about the future in the 50s versus the 70s versus the 90s versus today, it's a steadily decreasing amount of optimism, right? People in the 50s or even the 70s were about flying cars and living on the moon. People in the 90s are end of history, right? Nothing's going to change now. And people today are like, wow, is the world even going to exist when we're old? We don't know. So for me, that's the being conscious of the fact that we need to have a world to, and wanting to have a better world for our children is very much one of the things that keeps me going. But also, I think being conscious of the fact that is what capitalism does to us. It grinds us down and forces us to become cogs in a big machine to perpetuate itself and to enrich elites, enrich capitalists, right? So that to then say, okay, I've got to just keep my head down and work to pay off my mortgage, is to then basically accept the status quo and accept that the world is not going to improve, to become part of the problem. So for me, it's all about understanding structural issues as well. And if a coffee shop uncle were to say that to me, my response would be that I've actually gotten more left as the older I get. Right, I think I was the most pro-PAP when I was 18, and the most pro-capitalism, and and then I went to university. My mind started opening up. I started learning things, and I've grown more and more radical the older I get, because I realize the fundamental problems that are facing us need to be addressed, or we're not going to have much of a world for us to live in, let alone our children. And it's about trade-offs. There are plenty of things that I voluntarily give up or choose not to have in order to be able to do the work I do, right? I have 2 jobs. One pays for the other, and of course the one that's completely unpaid is the activism one, running New Narrative, right? And I choose to do that. And my family totally is very, supportive, and they bought into it. And, yeah, that's the kind of trade-offs that I choose to make. And, as Annika says, incredibly affirming to be able to do this work. But of course, as you mentioned earlier, as we keep, another theme that arises through all this podcast is recognizing the privilege that we have to do this. And privilege is responsibility, so I also feel a very strong responsibility to do it. So it's all those things, and that's what sustains me. Yeah. So you're dealing with the ultimate global issue, but you're dealing with it purely from, and your name is SG Climate Rally, and in a country which in particular hates cross-border, or at least our government, very strongly discourages cross-border solidarity and political activism, even as it at the same time encourages foreign investment and foreign capitalist influence on our government, on our policies, on our society. It discourages foreign civil society activism and any sort of cross-border solidarity. How do you square this circle? Do you have, are you working with climate change, climate crisis groups in other countries? But more broadly, how do you address a global issue from purely the perspective of a small nation state?
I can just take this first. So I think that one thing that is worth underscoring is just the fact that despite Singapore's size, we are one of the biggest economies in Asia, and so we have these sort of investments and stakes already in various coal power plants outside of our shores, right? And so already there's this sense of responsibility and a sort of shared stakes in the climate crisis. And our food systems are so undeniably tied to our neighboring countries that of course there's no way we can turn a blind eye and fight for Fortress Singapore, which is a word that we floats around our climate rally quite often. Is this idea that we want to actively problematize the idea of 100 billion going into building up a Fortress Singapore and creating seawalls against our neighbors. And I think that within Climate Rally we have been reaching out to climate activists all around. More recently in June, was it? We had a sort of webinar with climate activists in Thailand to discuss the fires that are happening in Chiang Mai. And so these are just a few of the, I guess, connections that are needed to be made. And do you want to speak to anything else?
No, but also I think what we want people to acknowledge and what we hope people recognize is just with kind of like the size of like our economy or the kind of capital we have, the kind of like exploitation that also we are complicit in, right? We put out an infographic a while ago about sand mining and what we're doing when we pride relentless growth, right? Where does the sand come from, to build and things like that? What kind of ecosystems are we destroying in the process? And then kind of like, can we acknowledge that power differential there? And so then it's also about trying to get people to be a bit more self-reflexive in kind of what are we doing when we're putting some of these countries in these positions, and how can we acknowledge and be accountable for some of these things? And that also then comes with maybe working with people on the ground in these communities in these other countries to see like, can we actually form solidarity? Because there are some people, in Singapore who don't necessarily agree with some of these practices, and our movement is one of those movements, right? How can we perform but also show allyship?
So if there are any young activists out there looking to get started, looking to join you, looking to get involved, how should they do it? How should they go about it?
Or actually any old actor, anyone. This affects all of us. Right?
How do we get involved? Yeah.
You can DM us on Instagram or on Facebook, SG Climate Rally.
And Twitter also.
Twitter as well. You can also shoot us an email. We check it quite regularly and we will certainly respond. And I think the thing that we do is just sort of not turn our backs to really anybody who agrees with our principles and wants to come on board. And I think at the moment we are restructuring, and so hoping to ensure that new members who come on board are not left sort of hanging. But yeah, I think certainly if you reach out and talk to us, we will reply and be happy to have you.
Can I press you a bit on that? Because I've had people reach out New Narrative and they say, well, they're older people. I don't with Instagram lah, Twitter, I don't have, maybe they have a Facebook account, they have email at best, but they reach out and they want to help. How can someone help if they're completely offline?
Yeah, I think that's something that we are thinking a lot about. Going back to this idea of organizing, right? That also means that we cannot exist completely online. So I mean, I think there are ways in which there are things that we're thinking about. How do we engage people? How do we work the ground essentially, right? How do we engage people offline? Yeah, if people want to engage with us and do something that's offline, we really want to start doing that. So the more ideas, the better.
Yeah, I guess it's also a question of accessibility, right? We talked about privilege and those challenges, but having that technology is also a privilege, and we really need to ensure that our movements encompass people who don't necessarily have that access. So I guess last question, what next for SG Climate Rally? What do you guys have planned in store? What are you going to do next?
Yeah, okay, so it's not necessarily what next, but kind of what's going on right now. And obviously this carries on for a while. Something that we've started is this campaign called Take Back 2050. So the premise is that we're trying to imagine a different world. A lot of times we focus a lot on kind of what is bad and the problems that we have currently and the things that we're facing, which we have to do for sure. But at the same time, right, can we imagine this world that we want to strive towards? And I guess the idea is that some of these, more utopian visions are not that, they're not unachievable. They are things that we can get towards. And so the idea is that we're trying to crowdsource submissions from regular Singaporeans and people who call Singapore home, to try and imagine, if we successfully avert the climate crisis, what will this Singapore in 2050 look like? And so the plan is to get people to imagine, and hopefully from that we can build sort of an image that we want to strive to go towards, and from there also that will help with co-developing our calls to action. The movement has evolved, and so we want to also then construct calls to action that are a bit more representative of where we are right now, and hopefully the calls to action then will also be sort of a roadmap towards the 2050 that it seems that everyone wants to head towards. So that's on our website.
I think another thing that I would say is that this is more of a broad philosophical stance of Climate Rally moving forward, is that, it used to be that we thought our work would end as soon as climate targets were met in this utopian future. But I think premising our existence on climate justice kind of further complicates it, right? Because now the work really never does end. And as long as there exists systemic injustices, we will continue to exist and the work will continue to be done, and we are very excited to do it.
Okay, so thank you so much to my guests Annika and Kristian from SG Climate Rally for coming down, talking to us, really going through the whole philosophy of organizing, the philosophy of climate change that's coming up, right, as well as your ideas as to how to speak to power and all of the very enlightening things that we've been talking about. Anyway, I want to thank PJ so much for having me on as co-host again, and so thank you very much, Kristian, Annika. All the best to you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you, Sean, for co-hosting. As always, fantastic questions. Thank you.
And thank you to you, our audience, for listening. Do check out our sister podcast, Southeast Asia Dispatches, for more news, interviews, and commentary from around Southeast Asia. Check out newnarrative.com for more stories on Southeast Asia. And as always, if you enjoy what we're doing and you'd like to support us, please go to newnarrative.com/join to join as a member. We really do need more members. Or go to newnarrative.com/donate to donate to our cause. Thank you very much, and see you next time.